Hello, welcome everybody. Today we're excited to have Miro Weinberger speak about housing. Miro is a lifelong Vermonter currently serving as the executive chair of Let's Build Homes, a new group advocating at the state and local level for policies that will address Vermont's acute housing shortage. Previously, Miro served as the mayor of Burlington, Vermont from 2012 to 2024. During his tenure, Weinberger led successful efforts to reduce emissions, dramatically expand housing production, and to raise Burlington's credit rating from junk bond status to AA. Despite having no public health department, Burlington's robust efforts to contain the COVID-19 virus and fight the opioid crisis earned widespread recognition. And in the fall of 2024, Miro served as a senior leadership fellow at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. Miro lives in Burlington with his wife, Stacy, and daughters, Leland and Ada. So let's welcome Miro for his lecture today.
First job was to turn the mic on, and I failed at that. Hopefully I'll do better from here. So, hello everyone. Thank you, David, for the introduction. Thank you, Linda Sparks, for reaching out to me last spring and inviting me to come speak to you. I had not heard of the program before that invitation, but I've studied up a bit since, and it's really quite remarkable that you've been doing this for 35 years, and the lineup that you have for this fall is daunting, I will say, and I hope I can kind of hold up my end of the bargain in it. I am going to speak to you about Let's Build Homes, this new organization that I launched with others in January of this year, and that we are trying to make really a part of the land use and housing policy community going forward. And I've been speaking a lot about Let's Build Homes in recent months. We just finished what we call the summer engagement sessions tour around the state. Really went to every region of the state to talk about the statewide housing shortage that we have. But in those sessions, I didn't really have this whole 45 minutes to talk about it. So what I'm going to try to do today is a little bit different. I'm going to try to really tell the whole story of how Let's Build Homes came to be, my personal involvement in it, and what we've done so far, but more importantly, look to the future and where we're hoping to go with this. And I'm looking forward to the question period and fielding whatever questions and challenges you might have about what we're laying out and what we are as a group trying to change the status quo in a lot of ways. So. Really looking forward to hearing your thoughts, and I will on the very final slide, and I've got maybe too many slides, but the final slide has some information about how, if you like what you hear today, we'd love to have you become part of the coalition, because that's really what Let's Build Homes is a coalition. But here is kind of the roadmap for how I'm going to try to do this talk, hopefully it's as much for me maybe as for you. Try to keep me on pace and on time here. I'm going to try to get through all that. So to start with how I came to this work, that story really goes all the way back to me growing up here in Vermont. I was born in Brattleboro, raised in the Upper Valley, went to Heartland Elementary School, Woodstock for high school before leaving the state for my 20s, college, graduate school, and some work. Growing up here, was fortunate to have a family with two parents. We were all, and I had two sisters, and we ate dinner together every night, and we talked about current events, talked about politics. I think that had a lot to do with, how I ended up finding my way into public service eventually. But the other thing I learned at the dinner table was about buildings. My dad was an architect, and we talked a lot about buildings and planning and land use, and He was kind of dad who would always be talking and explaining what we were seeing as we drove around the state and drove into other states and noticed how different the landscape was, the lack of billboards, and the difference in the type of development that happened. And another part about my childhood that in a funny way plays a big role is I was a baseball nut. I loved baseball. I loved playing it. I loved reading about it. I would listen to the Red Sox games every night. Go Red Sox! Yes, we're still sweating it out here, right? But for the wild card, I grew up on a dirt road in the middle of nowhere, which is a little funny because I've become this the mayor of Burlington and this advocate for cities and building more homes. I grew up on this long dirt road and pretty isolated. And one of the things I discovered you could do is listen to Red Sox games every night. So I did it just about every night. Then I would get up the next day and I would read the Valley News account of it and the Boston Globe account. It was a big part of my childhood. Those two things, baseball and buildings, kind of ended up coming together in a kind of interesting way. One was the summer after my freshman year in college, my mom let me borrow her car for the summer, and I drove across the country. I'd never been west of Pennsylvania before that. Drove to the West Coast, went to all these national parks, came back really an environmentalist in a lot of ways, studied environmental studies, became one of my majors when I came back. But the organizing theory for the trip was I went to all 26 Major League Baseball stadiums at the time. And I wrote about it. I got the Valley News, the local paper in the Upper Valley, hired me to, I think they paid me $75 a column, and I wrote every Saturday. And I think that my memory is they gave me like one of those early laptops that I had to find like a phone line to plug into to file stories, and I would send back film each week, undeveloped, of the stadiums, and they would develop it back. And it ended up being, in a lot of ways, sort of an architectural review of the stadiums. I had, without really fully knowing it, really fallen in love with Fenway Park, which you can see there on the left. And over the course of that summer, really became just struck with how different an experience it was to go to a stadium like that was integrated into a walkable neighborhood that had mass transit connected to it, that had other types of buildings, including housing around it. Very different experience than something like the old. Can anyone identify? This is where you list. This on the Fenway side. But anyone know this stadium? This is the old. It no longer exists. It's the old Veterans Field in Philadelphia, which, like a bunch of stadiums built in the 60s and 70s, was just surrounded by acres and acres of parking lots, and was kind of a terrible place to see a game. So that really started to influence my thinking and understanding that design really mattered, had a big impact on what takes place in the spaces once you've built something. Other kind of collision of baseball and design was this. My dad figured out, my dad was not a baseball fan, neither of my parents were. They were a little mystified that I had such an interest in this, but my dad figured out that a way to connect with me as a kid was to kind of get on board with this. And so one of the things we did together is, in addition to taking me to Fenway many times, we went down to Florida for spring training. And while we were there, after watching a few games one year, we drove from Winter Haven, where the Red Sox used to have their spring games, we drove out the panhandle of Florida, and drove through hundreds of miles of pretty unappealing, problematic development. Just Daytona Beach, miles and miles where the only, everything is just right up against the water. The only property that really has much of any value is what's right on the water. Everything built for cars. And then you arrive in this place called Seaside, Florida, which is a few hours out on the Panhandle, and it has these white sand beaches and this pretty remarkable development. It is a community that is a new community. It's like 45 years old now. These are recent pictures of it, and it is different than most of what new development that was built from, say, World War II until this town got built, in that it really went back to these older urban planning principles that we used to follow without even really having to think about it so much. Before there was an automobile, things got built close together, and there was a mixture of different types of buildings all within a proximity of each other. And you would have a commercial center, as you can kind of see there, and then homes a short walking distance from it. And other forms of transportation, not just the car, people can walk around and they can use bicycles. And this had a profound effect on me. It had a profound effect really on a lot of development in this country. This sparked a movement of sorts called the New Urbanist movement, which is still around today. I went this summer in Providence. It was the 33rd, I believe, they call them congresses for the new urbanism. And it remains a very vibrant and impactful and influential organization. So those were some early impacts on me. What this led to ultimately was me deciding to pursue a career in housing and development. And that is what, outside of a couple political stints, including interning for Senator Leahy, I started my career really working for Habitat for Humanity, first in Florida, or first in Americus, Georgia, where their headquarters are, and then in Florida. And went on from that to work for a number of different nonprofits, including one in Southwest Yonkers, New York, called the Grayston Foundation. And then when I moved back to Vermont in 2002, I started my own company with a partner called the Heartland Group, kind of based on the town I grew up in. And almost everything that we built for the 10 years that we were in business was permanently affordable housing where we were either partnered with or working as a consultant for affordable housing nonprofits in Vermont and New Hampshire. And we built hundreds of homes in 5 major projects over that period. And these early ideas influenced what we tried to get built. One that maybe goes straight, kind of linked between that life of mine and then my mayorship and what I'm doing now was this project at 237 North Avenue in Burlington. This is the old April Cornell warehouse. Maybe some of you guys know it. Early in the life of the April Cornell company, they were very actively, they used this, I think it was kind of, maybe even their headquarters, I'm not sure about this part of history, but it was very active at one point. By the time I moved back to Burlington, it was not very active. It was really mostly a storage warehouse, and returns would come in there. It still had a bunch of loading docks that the neighbors were not happy about. It's part of a very, it's in the Old North End. It's close up against a lot of housing. When we started looking at this site as a possible redevelopment site, I went in and pulled the permit files, and the file was literally like this thick of complaints about the truck traffic and the industrial, essentially sort of quasi-industrial commercial use that had been there for a long time. And I somewhat naively thought that given that dissatisfaction that people would like the idea of replacing that with a cafe on the ground floor and then housing on upper floors. And that is, we attempted to pursue that vision. It was 25 homes over enclosed parking garage and a cafe. And I learned some very searing lessons on this. This was one of the first projects we started. It was in 2000, really started working on it, I think, in 2002. I think we met with neighbors for the first time in 2003. It took us 5 years to get the zoning that was in place there. It had some encouragement to adaptively reuse the building, but it wasn't written very well. The zoning needed to be changed for a project to go forward. That was a year. Then we went through the development review board process, the local process, and that was contested and challenged by some neighbors. People compared the project to the U.S. invasion of Iraq. It was called a cancer on the neighborhood. Bravely, the DRB approved the project 4-3. It was a dramatic vote, as I recall. We had to wait for an alternate board member to get out of the shower and come down and cast the deciding vote. We were far from done. We're already a couple years into this, and then we had to go to get an Act 250 permit. We were not a well-capitalized company. We had sort of run out of money by this time for a little bit. It took me a few months to put the money together to keep going with the permitting process. Another 6 months or 9 months to get an Act 250 permit. There was never a lot of doubt that we would get the permits, but the way the system worked at the time, there was a lot of stops that we needed to do, and it was very easy for the people, particularly a neighbor, one neighbor in particular, a butter who was not happy with the project, and we tried to work out various accommodations to modify it. None of those talks succeeded. Instead, he appealed, and long story long, we did not get a final permit from the Vermont Supreme Court until July 1st, 2008, 5 years after we had started. Not only was that a problem that it took 5 years, 2008 was about July of 2008 in particular was about the worst month in the last 100 years to get a housing development permit because the economy was in free fall, and that was the start of the subprime mortgage lending crisis, and it became very difficult to finance any new development for years after that. And we had a particular challenge, which kind of goes a little bit to the story that Vermont still faces, and that there was a well-intentioned requirement on any housing in Burlington is that there's an inclusionary zoning requirement, which means that 20% or 15 to 20%, in this case I think it was 15, in this case it was 20% of the units had to be permanently affordable. And it's a very noble idea, and it's hard, I think it's impossible to argue with the concept behind it. The problem, though, is that the bank will only recognize the restricted value of these lower incomes on those units. And what we experienced was that we could not make the project finance because of the limitations on the rent on those units, and we faced years more of delays until we finally were able to get a significant amount of subsidy that allowed that project to go forward. So we eventually got about $500,000 in tax credits, and the project did eventually get built, and it's there today. It has Scout Coffee on the ground floor. It broke ground within weeks of when I took office as mayor, which of course I think many of the members of the public thought there was some relationship between those two, as if having been mayor allowed me to push this through, but really it was that 10-year process that culminated just coincidentally about the same time I got elected. But I learned the lessons I took from that did impact the way I thought about being mayor. So, and what we did there, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. Vermont's housing challenge. There's a lot to debate and disagree about within land use and housing, but one thing that just about everyone agrees is that housing is too expensive. There's just very hard to look at the kind of pain that our neighbors are in and not agree that there's something wrong with how high the costs are. When I say there's some stats behind this, so the Vermont Housing Finance Agency does the best job of sort of studying housing stats and trends in the state, and their report that came out a year ago says that half of all renters are paying more than a third of their income in rent, and that is long been seen as sort of the standard that we define a rent burdened household as anyone who's paying more than that 1/3. A quarter, so a very large number of our renters, fully 25% of our renters, pay more than half of their income in rent. And those renters in particular are really then quite vulnerable to housing instability. If something happens, if they have an unexpected medical bill, issue with their car, they lose a job, they can very quickly find themselves facing eviction and homelessness. Home ownership has, the whole profile on who can buy a home has really just shifted dramatically. Many of my peers often remark these days that we would not be able to buy the homes we're living in today if we were on the market. This is not some sort of sentimental wistfulness for the good old days. There has really something that has changed here. I don't quite have. I need to go back and get this stat right in my head, but I believe it is something like this, that up until 20, 30 years ago, the average home was approximately 3 times the annual income of the average wage earner here in Vermont. That stat is now something like 9 times the average wage earner. So there really is something has changed. The costs have gone up. You also see another indicator of this is the record homelessness that we are facing currently. And here's a chart that shows this. There's a couple different ways to measure this, but one is through this. The blue line is this annual point in time count that the state and municipalities do together. And you can see how dramatically the number of homeless individuals is individuals or households. I think that those are individuals, and it is more than doubled since the pandemic. The orange box up here, the orange line, is actually probably a more accurate measurement. This is something that is, as opposed to a one-time-a-year point in time, which is the blue line, the orange is the coordinated entry system's best analysis of how many people are in our homeless, are basically in the homeless system. This is a good government data system that tries to get all the different housing agencies and providers working together, and basically it is one database where everyone who is in the homelessness system in one way or another is supposed to go into that database. And there you see there's an even higher figure of over 4,500 Vermonters that are homeless. Now, this doesn't mean that the definition of homeless here is not, it does not mean they don't have any shelter. This includes people who are in emergency shelters. It includes people who are getting vouchers from the state to live in hotels. Less and less of those folks, but there are still some of those folks. It includes people who are kind of couch surfing on their friends and families' couches. It also does include the unsheltered population, which I don't have the number here, but there's hundreds of Vermonters are actually unsheltered, as we know, as you see if you go into Burlington and other parts of the state. So that's another example of how the cost of housing is too high. Here's another more surprising one, and I think something that shows that this problem now is bigger than just the cost of housing. It is starting to impact, and really I would say is a driver in many, if not most, of our other social and economic problems. This is a screenshot from a report that came out last summer that was about, from the Green Mountain Care Board had commissioned, about our healthcare system. And the question to the consultant was, what do we do to fix our healthcare system that is seeing runaway costs and that we're starting to see major service cutbacks in around the state? And the number one answer that they came up with, number one there literally, is build housing and other facilities. So and the reason they're saying this is the lack of housing has become a major challenge in hospitals, medical facilities being able to hire staff. Staff certainly at the kind of nurse, technician level, but even staff at the higher paid levels. I will tell you, on this trip around the state, I have talked to bankers and hospital executives who have talked about their challenge hiring doctors, hiring high-paid chief financial officers, because the people they are recruiting look at the salary they're going to be earning, look at the housing market, and for those folks, they'd be able to afford something, of course, but it is not something that is comparable to what they would be able to secure elsewhere in the country, and so they make a decision not to stay here or not to relocate here. Certainly any business, for years, just about any business that I've talked to has said their biggest constraint on growth and job creation is this housing issue. Although everyone might, I think if we did a poll here, it's dark, we won't do it, but I think a lot of people would agree with the idea that housing is too expensive. You get a big group together and agreement might break down from there on what should be done to fix that problem. I'll tell you, Let's Build Homes, as our name implies, is, or maybe more than implies, our name states, is focused on the creation of more homes. And here's why, and here's the link between the building of more homes and the expense. It is our belief is that the cost of housing is being driven up through kind of basic supply and demand issues. That that there has been that Vermont is a desirable place. People want to live here. People want to stay here. People want our kids want to return here. Increasingly, other factors are making Vermont more and more appealing. And climate refugees is a real thing. Huge number of people seeing how well Vermont managed the public health situation during COVID. We saw it for a couple years in a row there. We had the biggest net immigration of people of any state in the country. So we've had rising demand for a long time now, and that's really spiked since the pandemic. The supply has not been rising to meet that demand. And when you have a situation like that, where you have demand growing over a long period of time, significantly faster than supply, the cost of those scarce homes is driven up by competition. Why hasn't supply kept up? Well, there's a complicated answer to that, and I'll give you a few of those in a moment. But it clearly hasn't. We have not been building homes at nearly the rate that we did historically, and that is creating a scarcity. Demand is rising, supply is not keeping up with it, there's a scarcity. And we think at Let's Build Homes that the only comprehensive solution is to build more homes of all shapes and sizes for all of our neighbors. Let me just unpack the language there, because I think it's important. There have been a lot of efforts to build more affordable housing in Vermont over many decades, and we've been very good at that, really. We've had incredible political leadership that has secured a disproportionate amount of federal subsidy for Vermont to build permanently affordable housing. Senator Leahy was the master of small state minimums, so that there was sort of a floor on all these programs that the money would be given out per capita. It's given out per capita except for the small states, which get, there's a minimum that doesn't go below. And as a result, we've gotten a lot of subsidy. What we're saying here is we still support that kind of public investment in permanently affordable housing, but we also think we need to support housing of all shapes and sizes for people of all incomes and backgrounds. So not just the neediest Vermonters, people who have economic disadvantages. We need to care about the construction worker down the street being able to buy a home. We need to care about teachers. We even need to care, as I was saying a moment ago, about doctors and accountants being able to buy homes. Here's some stats behind the scarcity. This is the graph on the left compares the rate at which we've been growing over the last 20 years to what we were doing back in the 80s and the 90s, and you can see we're down, basically for most of the last 25 years, we've been growing at about a third of the rate that we were in the 1980s. And this is from the Vermont Housing Finance Agency Needs Assessment. Their projection of what we really need to be building over the next 5 years, here's what we have been building in terms of the number of homes. And you can see it's a positive story in that the number of homes has been creeping up. We've gone from under 2,000 homes statewide being built a year to a little under 3,500. But the green is their projection of what we would need to be building to really be addressing this housing shortage. It's basically, depending on whether you take the lower end of the range or the higher end of the range, it's about a doubling or a little bit more of the rate of housing is what they estimate we'll need to really fix some of those housing cost problems, those stats I mentioned at the beginning. So that's a daunting challenge to think about doubling or more our housing production rate. It's an ambitious challenge. That is explicitly what the Let's Build Homes goal is to try to get to this goal of building 30,000 homes as opposed, by 2030. And so that's our goal. Now, here's another way to look at these stats and what the lack of building has done quickly. I know I'm already a half an hour in here, so I got to speed up in some ways. But you can see, I think this is, as someone who grew up in Vermont, I find this an interesting graph. I had sort of accepted until I saw this graph, which was not one created by me. It was created by Kevin Chu of the Vermont Futures Project. I sort of thought at some intuitive level, I kind of thought the Vermont I'd known as an adult that had been barely growing was something that had gone on for a long time. But what you can see here is that that's not really the case, that the story of Vermont from World War II until the turn of the century is one of steady, consistent annual growth. That changes around the turn of the century, and we've had only about 6% growth in the last 25 years, coinciding with that period when during that period where we've been building at a much lower rate. Here's another interesting graph that really, I think, brings to life, this also from the Vermont Futures Project and Kevin Chu. We've all heard our governor talk for his whole time in office about our growing demographic challenges. And you can really see them here, and this coincides with the same period. When we stopped building, we saw some really significant demographic shifts. So here's 2000, here's where we are essentially now, or 2023. And you can see that the child age population has shrunk considerably. The kind of prime working period, 25 to 49 population has dropped by over 30,000 folks. And the orange and the red demographics are getting much larger. Now, I think it is great that people are staying here in retirement, that are able to be here, and certainly, my parents are part of that demographic. I'm creeping up into I'm squarely in the orange too. However, I think what you can see is happening is that older households tend to have more resources than younger households. If there's a competition for scarce homes, younger folks can get pushed out. We saw that explicitly happening with some studies that we did in Burlington, and I think this graph kind of shows that too. Why did this happen? I'm not going to go through all of this. I'm happy to answer questions about this. I think the basic answer is we made it very hard to build housing through a series of public decisions that we made at the state and the local level in all different areas, certainly in land use and Act 250 and zoning, but also with other things like historic preservation rules and the way the permitting process. But then even stuff that doesn't seem like it has much directly to do with housing, like soil contamination rules. We have one of the strictest. We have a threshold for contaminated soil that is not consistent with any other state in the country. Again, I don't think we can go through all these here, but these were public decisions that made it very difficult to build, and that led to situations like I described with my Burlington project, where, I got to say, I came away from that experience saying this is a system that I will never attempt to build in again. And I think a lot of people have been making that decision over the last 25 years. Here's a couple quotes from prominent folks in the country who see this issue as well. Ezra Klein has been particularly influential in my thinking. He makes the point, which I think we need to grapple with, that this problem is worse in places where Democrats, I'm a good Democrat, where Democrats have been in control. We have some of the biggest issues. He says the 5 states in the U.S. with the highest rates of homelessness are some of the bluest states in the country, not one red state on that list. And they're consistently unable to build enough homes at prices people can actually afford. And at the core of that failure is the failure to build enough homes, full stop. Here's a similar quote from Brian Schatz, senator from Hawaii, but I'm going to keep going here. So how do we solve this? The answer is, again, back to our name, is to build more homes. So let me give you a little bit of data showing how this can work. These, from the Financial Times, shows a pretty interesting graph showing how Minneapolis has approved new units at a much higher rate than these other Midwestern cities going back to before the pandemic. And that's what the graph on the left is showing. The graph on the right is showing that if you adjust for inflation, the rent today, or this is I think a year or two old right now, but the rent in Minneapolis is actually inflation adjusted. It's 20% less than it was back in 2017, while these other communities that haven't built at those high rates have been flat or even seeing rent continue to rise, considerably higher than inflation. Here's another headline, recent headline, January of this year. Austin rents have fallen for nearly 2 years in a row after a period of major housing construction. This one, it's a little dangerous, I think, even to put up. Where else have they succeeded? Well, Tokyo is now considered one of the most affordable cities in the world, which is shocking to me, given the reputation it used to have. You can have, for the equivalent of about $1,000 a month, a lot of people are able to get 2-bedroom apartments in Tokyo because they've built a lot of homes. Obviously, the answer in Vermont doesn't mean looking to Tokyo. Where can we look for examples of how we deal with this issue in Vermont? I would like to say immodestly that Burlington's history over the last 12 years actually gives some reasons for hope that you can make progress in this direction. So a focus of mine, having lived through those experiences I described to you, we tried to make it easier to build housing. Throughout my 12 years in office, we pursued a variety of different strategies, zoning changes, upzoning throughout the city, including the residential neighborhoods, to make it easier for what we call gentle infill for ADUs, duplexes to be put into backyards. We advanced major public-private developments. We expanded our local housing trust fund. We also, recognizing that the permanent housing takes years to build, we also invested in our shelter system to try to address the high level of unsheltered homelessness that we've all seen. So just a few images from this. Removing subjectivity, zoning changes made it possible for a project like this, the Nest project next to the old, now, what is it now? M&T Bank. It used to be People's Bank. And was Chittenden before that. This is a relatively new project that opened with 50 homes, 10 of them permanently affordable, 2 for formerly homeless families, and as well as some of the more expensive units in the city, all in one new building. This is what the neighborhood code that passed at my final city council meeting, it allowed. Instead of just a single-family house to be built on the typical lot in Burlington, you can now have 2 structures, each having up to 4 homes in it on many lots in Burlington. And we are starting to see some new investment in kind of infill, gentle infill housing, if you will. The major projects are probably ones you've seen in the newspapers. At the end of the day, this is where the bulk of the growth has happened in the last 12 years is from these large projects. The City Place project on the right, I didn't get a chance to update the picture. If we had a picture from this week, you'd see this project is now open finally. And the Cambrian Rise project there on the left is along North Avenue. About 500 homes have been built there. Sorry, what's going on? this is a project that isn't built yet, but I think those of you who've been coming to this lecture series, you heard from my friend Russ Scully about his watershed development, which is possible because of this upzoning that, it was illegal to build housing on this until a couple of years ago through long-standing policy the city had. We made it legal, and we made it legal to build at up to 6 stories and even 8 stories in the red areas there. Why does it keep going backwards on me? Here's one of the shelters that we built. You may have seen about this in the newspaper, the Elmwood Avenue shelter. And, you look at all this and you can see that, compared to before I came into office, when housing was not this kind of focus, to the kind of housing production we've had in recent years, it's not, we have big years and then lower years, but the general trend has been towards a substantial increase in the amount of new homes being created. And although it doesn't always feel like this, when we do have new supply come on, it does immediately have an impact on prices. After years of having a vacancy rate around 1% and seeing significant rental inflation from year to year, 2024, between what happened in Burlington and here in South Burlington, was a record year, and you actually saw rents stabilize, and the vacancy rate is up to the 3% for the first time in a long time. So these supply efforts really do make an effort. They really do work. All right, now I've got to I've not left myself enough time here. Another model that I want to just quickly point to that I've always thought is interesting is what happened out in Oregon. At the same time that we were making a decision to pass Act 250 in 1970, in 1973, Oregon, a state that has a lot of similarities if you think about it. It's a beautiful state, mountainous, farms, economic development pressures. They had a Republican governor, Tom McCall, who was concerned about what was happening, and he pushed through something called urban growth boundary legislation that had the kind of simple, straightforward concept that every municipality would draw a growth boundary looking out about 20 years into the future, and inside that boundary, it would be facilitated. It would ideally be easy to invest and build housing and other necessary investments. Outside, it would be harder. And they came up, this is the current urban growth boundary map of part of Oregon. There are 2 things to take from the Oregon model. One is that it has succeeded relative to Vermont. They have seen greater growth, certainly in terms of the total number of new homes, but on a percentage basis as well. Their population has basically doubled since 1970. Whereas Vermont has only grown by about 45%. We put, of course, Act 250, which did not have, it was a uniform standard for the whole state. It didn't say we want development in some places, we don't want it elsewhere. It said we're going to slow down development everywhere. And I think you see that reflected. There are other factors going on here, but you see that reflected in these different numbers. You see particularly since the last 25 years, the period I've been telling you we've had a real problem, you've seen their growth has been almost 4 times the rate of ours. So that's one lesson, is that this model, I think, has succeeded at both protecting the environment and minimizing the housing challenges. The other thing to take from the Oregon model is that the governor, when he left office, one of the first things he did out of office is he created something called 1,000 Friends of Oregon, which is a organization to advocate for this kind of vision for the state and to defend that legislation he had just gotten passed. The vision of Let's Build Homes in many ways is that, and that organization is still around 50 years later. The vision of Let's Build Homes that we created this year is to, in many ways, serve as a comparable organization. You can find our mission statement on our website. We are building a coalition. You can see we have more than 250 organizations have joined this, more than 800 Vermonters. We are advocating at the statewide level, but also at the municipal level, for policies that will make it easier to build homes. We are continuing to support permanently affordable housing, and we are trying to talk about development in a different way. I know I'm out of time here, so I will skip over this legislative success called CHIP, which you can read about, and just say, where we're trying to go from here. I do think the next thing we're going to advocate for is to build on this Act 181 process the legislature created, which is resulting in maps like this being drawn, which you can see if you look at the kind of dark pink areas. We're moving towards a system that will be a little bit like Oregon's, that will say we have consensus, we want growth in these identified areas. There's a lot of work to do to make it possible for homes to really be built in those areas. I think we need more than just a few of these. We need every municipality, every community in the state should be able to have a place like this. Housing in those areas needs to be by right. If we want housing to be a human right, it needs to be a right to build housing. And last thing, going all the way back to kind of my childhood journeys, we need to make sure that as we do have what I hope is going to be a new generation of home building, we need to be building great places that people will love, not just more housing. And Let's Build Homes wants to be a part of the conversation about how we do that. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Yeah, let's open it up for questions. Anybody, if you raise your hand, I'll bring you the mic if you have a question for Miro. Well, here's one over here. She'll get you from that side.
As the mic's coming over here, you can see, if you like that and want to be part of it, you can go to this QR code or letsbuildhomes.org, and that's how you sign up for the coalition. Hi, Libby.
Hi. Two things. One is we lived in Oregon the end of the 60s to the early 70s. At that time, the whole Oregon coast was public property. And when I want to go to the lake, almost all of the Lake Champlain is private property. And I think that's too bad. So the second thing is, do we care what our new housing looks like? Up at the top of Market Street, it looks like a tenement. I'm sorry to feel that way, but your father was an architect, and surely we could have architects designing. I mean, Burlington should be beautiful. It's got such a location. And I just wish that as we build new housing, we didn't build Lego houses and Monopoly houses, but really nice looking. Is it that much more expensive to add some architecture?
So great. Libby, I agree with you on both counts. One, it actually, especially I thought while we were trying to build more homes, we needed to, as mayor, I really felt like we needed to make sure that if we were trying to grow the population, that we were also investing in our public spaces and our green spaces. And over the 12 years I was in office, we ensured that there was public access to the lake all the way from Perkins Pier out to Rock Point, where we made a permanent agreement with the Episcopal Church so that the public can access that whole incredible natural area sticking out in the lake. Before that, very little of that was protected. So I think that's exactly right. As we grow, we also need to make sure that our truly valuable natural resources remain protected and there for Vermonters to enjoy. And I also do think we should. I still have the architect's son's thoughts in my head that I think it does matter how we build our buildings. I always love that Winston Churchill line. It's something like we shape our buildings and then our buildings shape us. And certainly aesthetically, it does matter how they're built. The Burlington Code that is leading to new housing being built does have some aesthetic. It tries to legislate in a way good design, and people can argue over good design, of course. But like that project I showed you of Doug Nette's that has terraces and different kind of heights as the building, different setbacks as the building goes up. I think to me that's an appealing, larger building. Other people may disagree on that. I think what is more important ultimately than the looks, the aesthetics of any particular project are the urban planning principles about are we going to have buildings that are built so the way Vermont communities used to, again, organically be built, where buildings were up against the street, where there was a defined public space on the street that municipalities are responsible for, where people are free to come and go, where there's street furniture, where there's outdoor seating, where there's public art. Are we going to minimize the impact that parking has on that public space by putting parking behind buildings? Are we going to have buildings close to each other so that within a 5-minute walk you can get to everything you might need for daily life and get to cafes? Or are we going to be spread out and have everything connected that you need to be in a car to get anywhere? Those planning principles, I also think we need to legislate, and what I hope comes out of this sort of Vermont's version of these Act 250 exempted areas is that you have rules that ensure we have good development based on these timeless urban planning principles in those areas.
Here's a Zoom question. Are there specific challenges in rural versus urban areas when it comes to building homes in Vermont?
Yeah, great. So there definitely, that's really been a great part of this summer I've done going around and having meetings all over the state, is there's interest in this issue everywhere. This is clearly, truly a statewide issue. A friend I went to high school with owns Jasper Hill Farms, the creamery out in Craftsbury, Vermont. Their housing challenge is so great out there that company has had to buy up homes so that their employees have a place to live. So of the 800 people and 250 organizations that have signed on to this coalition, it's really people spread out throughout the Northeast Kingdom is sort of overrepresented. So this is definitely something that is felt throughout the state. It is different in different parts of the state. It was very, what people were most concerned about in the central Vermont area was they've had a number of high-profile appeals where one or two sort of contrarian individuals have held up projects that the community has been working on for many, many years. Up in Franklin, there's a lot of excitement about this new infrastructure program that we helped get passed. That, in a real sense, that has been a big barrier up there, is the cost of new infrastructure and their enthusiasm there. So, and then there's no doubt that Chittenden County is a little bit different, as in many ways. The pressures here are different and more acute than in other parts of the state. So I guess I've been struck by how widely felt this problem is, but the solutions are going to be somewhat different in different parts of the state, and that's something we really, as a statewide organization, we're grappling with is how do we advocate for something that can be used everywhere. A great example of how we did do that in our first year with this community housing infrastructure program, we worked really hard to ensure that would be a program that certainly could be used and will be used here in Chittenden County by major projects, but unlike past infrastructure efforts in this state, there's a number of detailed provisions in there that should be particularly helpful to rural and smaller communities. So we're trying to think about those issues.
So capitalism can make people homeless faster than government can build housing. That's just real. And you left out a lot of things, which obviously there's a time limit, but maintaining existing housing has got to be central to keeping affordable housing. Government has to play a role in keeping big investment funds from buying up housing. And you guys on the build housing side, you take money from those guys often, so you don't actually step up and criticize that problem. And the other thing you dodge is people owning 2 and 3 and more homes. I mean, that's a contributing factor in Vermont, right? I mean, that's in my neighborhood. It is.
So great. I appreciate there are there's a lot of difficult issues to grapple with here. So on your last point first, I did have it. We kind of rushed through it, but it was one of the factors I put up there. Short-term rentals and second home ownerships is a factor that contributes certainly to the competition and the scarcity of homes. There's just no doubt about that. And when we're in the severe shortage the way we are now, I think it is justified to do what you can from a kind of regulatory or legislative perspective to try to prioritize permanent housing over second homes and short-term rentals. We in Burlington, we did that. One of the things that I passed in my last few years in office was an aggressive short-term rental regulation that reduced the number of kind of Airbnb and Vrbo properties in the city pretty dramatically, and that has been defended in court now and is held up. So there are times you need to do that. I will say, I think the fact that we have to have those conversations is unfortunate at some level and is a sign of the extreme scarcity that we have. Because we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that people being able to have a second property here so they can spend time with their grandchildren, there's some benefits that flow to that. People visiting Burlington, visiting South Burlington, and staying in an Airbnb. We're a place that a significant number of people are trying to make a living from the hospitality industry, and the restaurants that we love to go to benefit from people bringing money from elsewhere and spending it here. So there are trade-offs and consequences if we do try to limit those. There's also legal limitations on what you can do. Ultimately, I'd like to get us to a place where we didn't have to make those trade-offs, where I think we could be in a place of abundance, if you will, where those different needs are not really in the kind of competition with each other that they are now. I guess to your point about capitalism being part of the issue here, I think it can be very challenging to, capitalism, I think the problem that we face is we are in a system that government, sorry, let me take a different approach to that. If you said, okay, let's not rely on the developers to fix this. Let's just use our affordable housing nonprofit system that, like I said, is one of the best funded and most competent nonprofit housing sectors of any state in the country. Before the pandemic, and we got this huge infusion of federal money, that system could produce about 200 or 250 homes a year. So if you take seriously this report from the Vermont Housing Finance Agency that we need to be building something like 3,000, 4,000 homes a year, it really points out to we either need a fundamentally different system than we have today, like the one Bernie maybe has been trying to create, but which I think we're a long way from having, or you need to make the system that is here now work more effectively and make the kind of investments that we want to see it have, which certainly do include, to hit the third point, yes, we need to care about making sure the housing we do have doesn't go away. And that is a thing. Like, we lose a certain amount of housing every year because of neglect, and we need to, Less Built Homes certainly supports government subsidies that help when you have households that are in economic distress that need help like that. We support that.
Thank you. I think that's all we have time for today, but if you're going to take some questions from people if they want to after.
Absolutely. I'll hang out here as long as you guys want.
Thank Miro. Thank you for a great lecture.
Thank you.